Close their eyes for a minute and travel back in time. It's late 1943. America is fighting a war in Europe and in the Pacific. Rationing is severe. Blue stars are hanging in the windows. Glenn Miller is in the Army playing for our boys. You are an employee of Acme Machine Plant, anywhere USA. The boss has ordered a temporary halt to work and asked everyone into the central room.
Good evening, workers of the Acme Machinery Plant. I'm happy to see everyone here. I'm happy to see the women are here. I want to thank you for doing your part for our war effort, and I'm here to encourage you, and I feel that I have the right to encourage you. My name is Aletta Sullivan, and I am the mother of the Fighting Sullivans. It's a hard thing we went through, but my boys cannot have died in vain. So I'm going to tell you our story from the beginning. I'm a good Irish girl, and as a young lass, I met Thomas Sullivan, and in 1914, I married him in St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Waterloo, Iowa, February 1914. By the end of that year, I had given birth to our very first son, our oldest, George Thomas. 2 years later, we had Francis. We always called him Frank. The following year, my daughter Genevieve, the only girl out of a family of 6. So if any of you ladies here are surrounded by brothers, you know what she went through her whole life. The following year, Joseph was born, and the following year after that, Madison. 2 years later came the baby, Abel. After our marriage, we settled into 98 Adams Street in Waterloo, Iowa. It was a busy house. Mothers of young boys, you can imagine what it was like for us, but we were happy. Thomas worked for the railroad, so we had a little bit better than some people did. Not all my boys were able to graduate. Many of them decided they would rather quit and work at the Rath meatpacking plant. And eventually that's where our family worked. I was busy at home as a housewife and a mother. George, being the oldest, was the first to leave home, and he left us for the Navy. And then his brother Frank followed. They each served their 4-year hitch and came back home. Albert, the baby, was the first and only one that married. Right out of high school at 18, he met Mary Catherine, and they were wed. And the following year, my first grandson, Jimmy, was born. We had a full house, and even though Albert and Mary Catherine didn't live with us, they were always there for our Sunday dinners. It was a good and happy time for us. The boys had a friend. His name was William Ball. He also enlisted in the Navy, and he stayed in. December 7th, everybody was around. We had finished our dinner a little bit later than usual, and the girls were in the kitchen with me. And then we all went into the parlor to listen to the radio. We were listening to our regular Sunday show when the news broke in about that horrible sneak attack at Pearl Harbor. And the first one to say anything was Genevieve. For you see, Bill Ball was stationed on the USS Arizona. And not only was he friends with George and Frank and all the boys, because he lived right over in Fredericksburg, Iowa, but, well, you ladies with big brothers, probably happened to you. Their friends took an interest, and Genevieve and Bill began courting when he left for the Navy. There was a hush, and then the usual tumult over these. Cannot even explain how we felt at that time. Just out of nowhere, all eyes were towards Europe. Yes, the Japanese were active in the Pacific, but they had made no threats to us. We were all worried about the boys that might be going overseas. Well, you all know that the next day, our President Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress, gave his Day in Infamy speech, and asked them to declare war. And from one day to the next, we were from peace and a war on two different fronts. We went to Mass and we lit candles. And then, in a few days, the word came about the USS Arizona, and that Bill, who sat at so many of our supper tables and played sports with the boys, and who dear Genevieve was so sweet on, well, Bill was gone. As a mother of sons that have been in the Navy and 3 more sons, I worried. I didn't miss Mass for a day. I lit the candles I could and I prayed. Well, Christmas came and went, and we had another Sunday dinner. And of course, Albert and Mary Catherine and little Jimmy were there with us too. We were cleaning up again. Then I shushed the girls in, and I finished up. And instead of the usual chattering and teasing and laughing in the parlor, when I walked in the parlor, it became deadly silent. And I thought, what are these boys up to? For my boys were thick as thieves all their life. In their childhood, they started a motto and they kept it to the end. They always said, we're the Sullivan boys and we stick together. And that was their motto always. They included Genevieve as the favorite sister. I looked around. I didn't know what to say. I sat in a chair. And I said to them, well, out with it. You boys are never quiet. Genevieve and the girls are in the same room with you and you're not teasing them. So finally George, the oldest, was the one that spoke. And he always felt, because he was the oldest, he was responsible not just for his baby sister, but for all the boys. And that's when he told me they were enlisting. Originally, they weren't going to have Albert go with them. But when Mary Catherine saw how much Albert wanted to be with his brothers and wanted to serve, she told him to go. What can you say? All 5 of your boys are standing there or sitting in the room with you and telling you they're going to enlist to fight the war. I remember I was crying a little. And finally George said, well, fellas, I guess we're going in. And if we go in, we're going in together. And if worse comes to worse, why, then we'll go down together, and that's the way it should be. I tell you, it was hard to give 5 sons to the Navy all at once. It was hard when George left. And it was hard when Frank left, but they left in a time of peace, and we knew after 4 years they'd be home. But now, the whole world was at war, and all 5 of my boys were going to fight in this. I'm not the only mother. Mothers throughout Waterloo and throughout our nation were sending their sons off to war. But to give 5 boys to the Navy all at once. They enlisted on January 3rd, 1942, and they had a condition. And they told the recruiter, if we don't enlist and serve together, none of us are going in. When they told me this, I said I thought brothers couldn't serve together. They said, Ma, it's war now. And the recruiter guaranteed us we'd serve together. Mm-hmm. And so they left for the Great Lakes Naval Training Center in Illinois. In some time, Thomas and Genevieve and I went to Bill's funeral. Genevieve was young. She was only about 23. I knew there would be other beaus and that life goes on. But how my heart broke for her, having her first true love leave and never return. On February 15th, the Sullivan boys were assigned to the USS Juneau. It was an anti-aircraft light cruiser and the very first U.S. battleship that was ever commissioned in camouflage. Now, I had been on one of their ships when George and Frank were in, and I found this all very interesting. Well, once public relations found out about the Fighting Sullivans, and that was the nickname they were given, they became quite a tool for recruitment and for the war effort. There were pictures of them taken. You've probably seen them. Maybe there's even one here in your plant. The Fighting Sullivans around their bulkhead door. They look so handsome in their little sailor uniforms. I was bursting with pride. We didn't know exactly where they were going, what they were going to be doing. Now, George and Francis, because they had been in the Navy before, had a little bit of a higher rank. George was a gunner's mate second class, and Francis was a coxswain. Joseph, Madison, and Albert were all seamen second class. We never missed any news reports on the radio. My husband started attending Mass regularly also. He didn't always miss it, but now he never missed it. Genevieve grieved, but she worried for her brothers. The boys wrote home to me, and Genevieve made walnut drop cookies, and they often wrote Mass for them, so we would pack up bunches and send them to them. They always ended their letters with, "Keep your chin up." Well, I think now is a good time to do that, don't you? Yep. We must keep our chins up. Then, in November of 1942, the letters dwindled and stopped. All of December, I heard nothing. One day, a lady traveled all the way across Waterloo and knocked at my door. And when I opened it, I had never seen this lady before. And I said, "Yes." And she said, "You're Mrs. Sullivan, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "May I come in?" And she seemed earnest. So I invited her in. I was watching little Jimmy because Mary Catherine was off to work that day. When Albert enlisted, of course, they lost a lot of their income, so we just brought him into our home. And then she went, just like you good folk here, to support the war effort. I offered her some tea, and as we sat talking, he said, "My son's in the service also," and she told me he was wounded and where, and she said, "He wrote a letter to me from the hospital ship." And then she hesitated, and she flushed, and then she finally took a deep breath, and she said, "Mrs. Sullivan, one of the lines in his letter said he heard that all the Sullivan boys were dead." And she flushed again, and how does a mother respond to something like that? And I didn't say anything for a minute, and then she said, "I am so sorry that I came to tell you this, but if it was my son and another mother knew," and she said, maybe he's not. Maybe none of them are," she said, "but I would hope if it was you, you would come and tell me." And so I thanked her. And she left, and she apologized again before she left, and I said, "No, thank you very much." Thomas came home, and I told him, and we agreed we wouldn't say anything to Mary Catherine until we knew for sure. Well, the next day, Thomas went to work. And I thought, what too, what I'm thinking. And then I was thinking, oh, I was supposed to sponsor that ship and christen it, and well, I still wanted to do that. And then I thought, and who's the commander of the Navy? So I got my writing paper out and I addressed the letter to our president. And I told him I had not heard from my boys. They were the Fighting Sullivans. And that another mother came and told me that her son heard that they were killed. I said, we know nothing. Can you help us? January 13th, my husband was up before everyone. And I was intending the baby with Mary Catherine, and he saw a black car pull up outside. And 3 Navy officers got out of the door. He told me later, when he opened the door, they said, Mr. Sullivan, we're here to talk to you about your sons. He took a deep breath and said, which one? The naval officer paused and said, all of them. Thomas ushered them in and had me and Mary Catherine come out. They were very kind men. They explained the circumstances. They stayed with us for about an hour. They said that all 5 of our boys were missing in action off of the Solomon Islands. He said he couldn't tell us a lot more. He couldn't tell us how or why at that point, because of military actions over there, and they didn't want to jeopardize it. Well, excuse me. I finally said, we understand, sir. Can you tell us anything more? And he said, no. The next day, the headline banner of the Waterloo newspaper said, in huge letters, Sullivan's missing off the Solomon Islands. Newspaper reporter came to our house and he quoted me as saying, I know it doesn't sound good, but I just hope that someday, maybe one of them will be found somewhere and we'll hear of it, and that's my fervent hope. But my boys are gone, and they have gone together. It's what they wanted, and it was their wish. And they did it for their country's victory. Would you believe I got a letter from the president himself? I have it here with me. I'd like to read it to you. President Roosevelt took the time to write to us, and it says, My dear Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, the knowledge that your 5 gallant sons are missing in action against the enemy inspires me to write you this personal message. I realize full well there is little I can say to assuage your grief. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I want you to know that the entire nation shares in your sorrow. I offer you the condolences and gratitude of our country. We who remain to carry on the fight must maintain spirit in the knowledge that such sacrifice is not in vain. The Navy Department has informed me of the expressed desire of your sons, and he calls each of them by name. George Thomas, Francis Henry, Joseph Eugene, Madison Abel, and Albert Leo to serve on the same ship. I am sure that we all take heart in the knowledge that they fought side by side. As one of your sons wrote, we will make a team together that can't be beat. It is the spirit which in the end must triumph. Last March, you, Mrs. Sullivan, were designated to sponsor a ship of the Navy in recognition of your patriotism and that of your sons. I understand that you are now even more determined to carry on as sponsor. This evidence of unselfishness and of courage serves as a real inspiration for me. as I am sure it will for all Americans. Such acts of faith and fortitude in the face of the enemy convince me of the indomitable spirit and will of our people. I send you my deepest sympathy in your hour of trial, and pray that in Almighty God you will find the comfort and help that only He can bring. Very sincerely yours, Franklin D. Roosevelt. In time, the Navy came to see us again and informed us that all 5 of my sons were dead. They were lost at sea, and we had no bodies to mourn over or to bury even. It was hard enough to lose 5 sons, but not to be able to look on them one last time, not even one of them. The day we were informed, Thomas asked me, should I go to work? Shall I stay home? And I thought about it. I said, the boys would want you to go, Thomas. Those trains must run on time. Supplies and equipment must be delivered. It's all part of the war effort. And he said, you're right, they would. And so with a heavy heart, he went to work. Employees of the Acme Machinery Company, I am asking you to do your part in this war effort. My sons did theirs. We have to stick together. I'm telling you, if you get up tomorrow and you have a headache, take some aspirins and come into work anyway. Our boys in their foxholes can't decide to just sit there with a headache. They have to go out and fight. If it's a nice sunny day and you really don't feel like working, come into work anyway. Our sailors and Marines on board ship can't say, I'm going to go out fishing today. I'm going to go for a stroll. No matter what hardship you have, as long as it will not interfere with your work, you show up here and do your part. Give it all you have. No gold bricking. Don't take extra long lunch. Work as hard and efficiently as you can. After all, the boys in the planes can't be cut any slack. They can't goof off, can they? Be like the Sullivan brothers. Do your part. I wish that everybody in this country would buy all the war bonds so that other mothers' sons could come home sooner. I know things are tight. And you ladies, I know that many of you, it's probably your first job outside of your home. Many of you probably were like me, married out of high school, and became homemakers. Mary Catherine and Genevieve are both working in war production plants now. I know it's hard for you. You're probably working in these war production plants and have a husband, a father, a son, a brother. In Europe, in the Pacific, you are carrying double duty. And men, I realize that most of you are here through exemptions. This plant is part of the war effort. What you manufacture here must be done. If there was someone else could take your job over, they'd let you enlist, but you have the skills that can carry on here. Ladies, don't forget to save your grease when you're done cooking and turn it in for explosives. Don't shop on the black market either. Abide by rationing. So maybe you're not having beef this week. Maybe you can't have that new pair of shoes. Maybe you don't have enough gas to go over to the next town to visit somebody. But those new pairs of shoes that you're not getting are putting boots on one of our GIs. The gas that you can't go visit in the next town with, that's fueling a Willie Jeep. So you can't have a cake with eggs and sugar. There's a lot of recipes for victory cakes. How many of you here have a victory garden? Let's see a show of hands. Any victory gardens? I applaud you. For everything that you grow, you can feed your family. And that's that much more we can ship to our GIs, to our sailors, to our airmen, to our soldiers, to our Marines, and to our coasties. Do your part. We, as a country, have to be like the Sullivan brothers. We must stick together. For those of you who have lost loved ones, I share in your grief. My front window changed. Early this year, I went from having 5 blue stars on a flag to 5 gold. But when the office, a civilian came to us and said, please, Mrs. Sullivan, will you and your family help us? We understand your sorrow. But if you would talk at shipyards, if you would talk at defense plants, how you would encourage our nation. And I need to tell you, Genevieve is not with us because she is now a WAVE recruiter. So she is honoring her 5 brothers and her sweetheart Bilbao by being a WAVE recruiter. At first I was reluctant. I have never given a speech anywhere. But they said, your boys would want you to do this. So I went on to sponsor and to christen that ship, and I am making these speeches. The more we stick together, the more you observe rationing, the better you do your job, the faster this war can be over. If you can afford it on payday, buy a war bond. We all, every single one of us, must be like the Sullivan boys and do our part and stick together to win this war. Thank you. If you'll excuse me a minute, I'm going to get my friend Regina. There are so many things the Sullivan family did not know about their boys. The USS Juneau, from August until it was sunk, took part in the Solomons campaign. They had delivered supplies to our Marines and were leaving with a group, and they were torpedoed by a Japanese sub. There was another ship with them also. They were limping back. They were hoping to get to their home base of Espiritu Santo. They were hit by a second torpedo, and eyewitness accounts state that it wasn't struck, it didn't explode, it disintegrated. They said that it blew up so fast, and they are guessing that it hit right in the ammunition hold. And it was a light cruiser, so it wasn't heavily armed. So it was hit there, and they said it just went up and sunk, and there was nothing. Nothing. Now the Helena was there, and anyone that saw it on the other ships could not believe there would be any survivors. But the Helena radioed a B-17 in the area and told them to look for survivors. The B-17 would not break radio silence for home base. And so when it got back several hours later, they reported this. The report got lost in the shuffle. So the survivors, and there were about 100 out of the 480 that were on the Juneau, there were about 100 sailors made it to the water. But they suffered the same fate as the USS Indianapolis. They lost the report. So it was several days. It was several days till they even went out to search for survivors. At that time, out of the 100 that made into the water, there was 10. Joseph, Madison, and Francis were killed instantly. Abel, the youngest, the father with the young baby, and a really cute thing, Abel's widow, as far as I know, is still alive. She was in 2012, and she told people that Albert was so nervous and excited that he passed out at the altar at his own wedding. Then they all just kind of looked, and then he got up and they carried on. That's how excited he was. Albert made it off the ship. Wow. He survived, but the next day he drowned. Now, a few days later, George, he was the oldest, and as Mrs. Sullivan told you, George always felt responsible for his siblings. The survivor said it was a terrible thing because as soon as he came up, he was calling Albert, Frank, Matt, Joseph. And they said he kept calling. Over the days, he will call out for them. Now, these survivors were in life rafts. It was in the South Pacific. It was hot. They had no supplies with them. They were baking in the sun, the salt water. They dehydrated. So many of them just succumbed to a delirium. You even know, like, when maybe someone in your family gets severely dehydrated, how they're kind of out of it? Well, imagine days of this. So about 4 or 5 days after the sinking, George stood up, took his clothes off. He said, I'm going to take a bath, Mom. And he jumped into the water and swam around the raft. And then they heard the screams. And like so many of the others, and just like the USS Indianapolis, the sharks got George. Their family never knew this. And how I came to do Mrs. Sullivan, were any of you here last year when Big Mary was here? Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, Big Mary has been an interest of mine since about 2000, 2002. Been doing it everywhere. And one day I thought, she's a limited audience, and you're going to have to keep going further and further afield. You need to develop more characters. I thought, nobody was inspiring me. And then I was down at the World War II weekend in Reading. Has anybody ever been to MAM's World War II weekend? It's the most amazing place. I met Dutch von Kirk, the navigator from the Enola Gay there. I met I met the Band of Brothers, I met Buck Compton. One year they had the actual Marines that HBO made the series The Pacific about. And I'm telling you, they were real Marines, because as I went down the line, I'd get their autograph. I said, now, if you give me your cheek, I kiss Marines. And I went, and their wives were standing behind them, and as soon as I said it, the cheek would come out, and the wives were grinning. They were like thrilled. I got to the very last Marine. Now remember, these guys are 85 or so. I got to the very last one, guys. I said, if you'll give me your cheek, I kiss Marines. And when I went to kiss his cheek, he turned around and kissed me full on the lips. Yeah. But I was there with one of my boys, and I'm looking around, and been there many times. I'm a volunteer there now, and I thought, I'll do something else. I should do something. I should do something I can do down here. And then it hit me, Mrs. Sullivan. I didn't know much about her. As a child, I just knew that she was a Gold Star mother, 5 sons in the Navy. And then I started doing the research. And the more research I did, the more amazed I was by all of it. Wow. I have a Blue Star flag hanging in my window. My cousin Alice will tell you. I am the obnoxiously proud mother of a United States Marine. Thank you. Thank you. Hoorah. He's retired from the Corps, and he hated it, so he enlisted in the Army Reserves. He's not with me because he has drill this weekend. But yeah, he goes down, he volunteers at World War II, and actually with me on occasion too. I cannot in any way imagine what Mrs. Sullivan went through, because I cried for months. From June until August when he enlisted. No, it was April. I just cried. The one guy came into work the one day, the PennDOT guy goes, I want you to meet him. He was in the court too. I said, oh, thank you. And my son, he goes, I told him, he goes, you should have seen this lady. You couldn't say Marines to her. You couldn't say anything to her. She burst into tears. I can't imagine sending off 5 in the time of war. When my son called me, let's see, he enlisted in September. He called me he was home after MOS training in June, and about 2 weeks later he called me and said, Mom, I'm going to Iraq in July. And I don't remember anything after that. I know my knees felt weak and everything, but
Wow.
how could you
My mother had
send...
the same reaction when I called her. She said, what, you've been in that long? And you're going? I said,
Oh, no, I
Mom,
knew he would go
I
right
knew we
away.
were going to,
Yeah.
we just didn't know when.
Yeah.
And I hated to call her. I hated to give her that information.
I knew he would be going, and then he called me, said, it's for another month, and this and that. He told me he was going to Fallujah, and I'm like, oh. But I have to tell you, I prayed about it, because I was on the verge of hysteria, and a warm feeling came over me, and I was never worried the whole time he was deployed, because I knew he's going to come home to me okay. As a matter of fact, customers would say, well, you're handling this a lot better than you did him enlisting. I'm like, I know. The first thing I said to him, I said, you can't enlist in the Marines, they're all crazy.
Yeah, there.
They are. I'm proud to say my son is a Marine, my 3 big brothers are Marines, and my great-nephew's a Marine. And I have about 100 Marine friends, and if you go on my Facebook, you'll see it. And that's my little segue into, Alice said it'd be okay, what I do now. I started, when my brothers were in, we always shipped cookies at Christmas, different things and that, and the Standard Speaker at that time would publish the names and addresses. And my grandmother was not happy, so every military person on that page got a card. So then she would address them. I was only maybe 9, 10, and I would sign them and that. I still have a silk printed picture at home that one of the guys sent me. So my son was the first on my group of Marine moms to go. And another boy that graduated in a different platoon went. So we all decided we were going to send care packages. So they shipped me money for John, they shipped somebody else money for Billy. Then Randy went. Then the Hargis boys went. And then I just started sending to all of them. And then if I heard of somebody, I started sending to all of them. And I worked at a truck stop. And I would either have my Proud Marine Mom pin or something on it, or if they, had a military hat on, I would comment on them. I got a lot of addresses from total strangers. One time I went home and got an email. My husband said he was in a truck stop and you want to send her? I said, yeah. Anybody I can. I get, when the guys come home, I say, who's still there? I have sent to every branch of the military. I've sent to the little Air Force girls. I even sent them Beanie Babies and toys because they'd stick them and in their pockets or packs and when they went out in the villages. Because the one girl said, thank you so much for the goodies. And I used to make poppers around a paper towel tube with tissue paper and stuff. And she said, we take them out in the villages. I said, good, well, somebody gave me like 4 totes full of Beanie Babies, so I started shipping them. So if anyone here currently has someone deployed, I'll be glad to ship to them. I do fundraisers. When I was working, it wasn't as hard. Now that I'm not working, it's a little bit. So I make crafts and sell them, and I have to tell you, sometimes I make more in donations when people hear what I'm doing. But then, of course, on the table is a picture of my son in his Paris Island graduation picture, and my adopted son, George Herrero, before the Marine Corps ball. And I have our flag, I have the Marine Corps, and I get so many stories from that. But that is what my mission is now. Does anyone have any questions? I explained it pretty good, huh?
Yeah.
Ma'am,
I would encourage you all, D-Day weekend, if you can make the trip to Reading, look up Mid-Atlantic Air Museum World War II weekend. Also, in my little beloved Eckley, we have a World War II weekend in July, and a lot of it is focused on the home front. This year I'm doing this display about milkweed and how the kids would pick the pods and bring them to school, and the Red Cross would pick them up, and how they would knit squares. We have a swing dance that night too. So I gave Alice a bunch of brochures, and hope I see some of you there. But you won't know me when you come to Eckley, because just like I'm not Big Mary now, I'm a different person there too. So thank you for having me here. I really appreciate it. No questions, huh?
Yes.
Okay, what up now?
I want to thank Alice for making the contact for this tremendous, tremendous story.
Thank you. Alice was my cousin.
I know.
But we never knew it until she saw me perform at Eckley one time, and she came up, she goes, Regina, I'm your cousin. I'm like,
That's where she saw you.
yes,
Okay.
that's how we met up. Yes.
Also, because of the deaths of those 5 sons, what was it? Was it the military? Was it the government that said they will no longer serve members?
No, actually, that was in place before World War II,
Yeah.
that siblings were not to serve together, but it was overlooked. On the USS Juneau, there was the 5 Sullivan brothers. There was another set of 4 brothers. There was actually 9 set of siblings on the Juneau.
Wow.
Now, had the Juneau returned to Homeport, 2 of the Sullivans and 2 of the other brothers were being transferred because of their duties to another ship, but of course they never made it. Now, they did enact the sole survivor,
Yeah.
like you saw in Private Ryan.
Yeah.
But even now in Iraq, I saw the picture of the 2 most beautiful sisters, Lady Marines, serving together. They can serve together. During Vietnam, my one brother who just passed away was in Japan. My other brother went overseas, and here they ended up in the same barracks,
No.
a floor apart, but Japan was considered part of the war zone. As soon as they found out that there were 2 Drashers there, they sent my older brother out. But yes, they are allowed to serve together if they want to.
Didn't Abraham Lincoln address that during the Civil War?
Yeah.
He wrote the lady who sent so many sons.
Mrs. Bixby.
Was that?
Yes,
She from
and
Eton?
sacrificed them on the altar of their country and all. Yes, yes. He personally wrote to
Yeah, it was a
her.
great letter.
Yes, the Bixby letter. Yeah, it's great. That it?
You said the last name was Drasher. What's Donnie Drasher?
Where's he from?
Hazelton?
He is. His father and my father were probably cousins. Drashers are like horse pies. They're all over down there.
Before I got out, I was in that Hazelton garden,
Okay.
and then he was still there.
Mhm.
He got out as a civilian. He became the sergeant major, but he moved out. And then he came back as a civilian. He was selling USAA insurance or,
One of my uncles had 10 children, legitimate, and 1 extra somewhere. So that shows you the scope of our family. A lot of my first cousins I never met because they married and moved away. So, but the Drashers were everywhere down there.
just like half of Hazelton I'm related to
Yeah.
my grandfather because he had and his Brenner's recycling guy.
Okay. Oh, I go there all the time.
I never knew I was related to him until I'd seen him. I'm like,
Right.
wait a minute, really? Yeah. I was like, when? You didn't know? Yeah. No.
I have a lot of military history in my family. I told you about my son, my great nephew, my brothers. My stepdad was airborne, and by the time I met him, he reminded me of Jack Lemmon and Grumpy Old Man. For example, when my kids went sledding, oh, be careful. When I was a kid, so-and-so hit a tree head on and broke his neck. I'm like, Bucky, you're sledding. This is the man I knew, okay? So he said something about the Army one time and different things. And I remember he said the one time they went to church and he walked in and some kid yelled, "There's John Wayne." And he said, he's looking all around and he turned back. The kid was pointing at him. He was very proud of it. So being me, and this was in the 80s, I'm not a shy retiring. Alice is kind of quiet. I'm brash and forward and bold. And I will interrogate people. So I was going somewhere with my stepdad. So what did you do? He got his draft notice, went down, enlisted in the Army. Do you know why he went airborne? He got $50 more a month. That was the sole reason. And I said, wait, you jumped out of a plane. He's like, yeah. And I kept saying, no. Well, what did you, and then next, what did you do? And he said, well, I had to kill silently. And he said, I parachuted behind enemy lines. I had to kill silently. I took out a fuel dump. And I'm looking at Jack Lemmon driving the car. And I said, Bucky, I'm sorry, I just can't believe you jumped out of an airplane. And I was so incredulous, he couldn't stop laughing. He goes, well, I did 13 times. I'm like, okay. And then the clincher that really made me believe him, he said, and do you know why we tied our pants legs shut? I said, well, wind resistance so they don't blow up. He goes, no, we're all adults here. He goes, so when you jump out and shoot your pants, you don't hit the guy below you on the way down. I knew it then. Now, last July for World War II weekend, I wrote a 1940 style radio show called The Eckley Hour. And because it was Eckley, we couldn't have, say, Bob Hope or Carol Lombard, but we did have Wanda Miranda, her Carmen's sister, come, things like that. And I told everybody, if you have World War II ancestors, just let me know. So I worked in my 2 aunts who were WAC nurses. And the one part said, wedding bells are going to be ringing in the valley. Gordon Drasher has returned home from Europe, and he has Miss Elizabeth Dahlberg of Hollywood, who waited for him all this time to marry him, and she said yes. Now my aunt was still alive. She was 95. My uncle had died about 20 years before. When I was small, before I even knew what D-Day was, my mother said, you know, your Uncle Gordy was in D-Day. And I said, what's that? She said it was a big, big battle, that the water was red with blood and stuff. So I messaged my cousin, do you have anything you could display? I kept, oh, she's got a whole bunch of stuff here. Next message says, holy shit, there's love letters.
Love letters.
My aunt died 4 days after that radio show.
Wow.
So I helped clean that. We're talking about different things. My uncle, you know, like my stepdad as he got older would say, well, we're in the Army, or some guys say, well, you know, that's not the way it happened when I was in the service. I never heard any Army service, anything ever come out of his mouth. He was a quiet gentleman. I loved him. I found out that my Uncle Gordy wasn't just in D-Day, he was also in North Africa and Anzio.
Oh.
He had 8 battle stars and the invasion spearhead.
Wow.
So my cousin and I, she has pictures and letters, I'm doing research, and hopefully by this time next year there'll be a book out called A Quiet Hero, Love from Europe. Talk to everybody. You would be amazed, just by talking to the people, what you would find out. My stepdad's own grandchildren didn't know any of this. And so he gave to my family, his step family, because he always said, I thought the kids would want to bring stuff to school, and they never asked. They said, we're interested. So I have all his pictures from the Philippines. I have all his pictures everywhere he went, a Japanese naval flag. He was airborne and quartermaster, but for some reason, he was in the room in the Philippines where the surrender was signed. I have all that. Just like my grandmother ran away from home when she was 16 and got married. None of her children or grandchildren knew it except me, because I'm bold, I'm brash. I saw a picture and she said, it's our wedding picture. And I said, oh. And I looked at him, I said, you saw the picture, Alice, right? And I said, oh, Nanny, no wonder you fell in love with him. Oh, my grandfather was so handsome. And then she told me that whole story too. Those of you who are my age and older, if nobody wants to listen to you, write it down. Just like Big Mary Septak. Her story would be lost. She was down to 2 paragraphs this big. Hopefully, I think it's May or June, her story's going to be published in an international e-zine, and I'll let Alice know if it gets there. So thank you very much for having me. Hope to see you at Eckley, and share your history.
Once again, what a marvelous, marvelous presentation.
Yeah.
Hi, Joe.